The whip cracked like a rifle shot in the dusty stillness. Elara bit her lip until copper flooded her mouth, choking back the scream, clawing its way up her throat. Silas's voice, thick with whiskey and rage, echoed off the sagging porch of their prairie shack. Useless. Barren ground. Each word landed harder than the leather biting into her back. The unforgiving sun beat down, bleaching the bones of the land around their failing homestead. Her tears mixed with the dirt on her cheeks, tracing paths through the grime of a life shrinking smaller every day. How long could a body endure such breaking? How long before the vast, empty West swallowed her whole? Was there no mercy in this hard land for a woman who couldn't give life? The silence after Silas stormed back inside the clapboard shack was almost worse than the whipping. It was a thick, heavy thing pressing down on Elara like the oppressive Dakota heat. She remained slumped against the rough-hewn porch post, the wood scraping against the raw stripes on her back beneath her thin calico dress. The sting was a familiar companion, a cruel counterpoint to the dull ache that lived permanently in her bones, the ache of failure, of emptiness. Barren. The word echoed in the hollow spaces Silas's fury left behind. It wasn't just an insult. It was her sentence, etched into the fabric of her existence on this desolate patch of earth they called a homestead. 5 years. 5 years of Silas Barrett's hopes hardening into resentment, then curdling into this sharp, relentless cruelty. 5 years of her monthly courses arriving with cruel punctuality, mocking the cradle gathering dust in the corner of their single room. Elara pushed herself upright, wincing. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed the torn fabric over her shoulders. Dust coated everything. The warped porch planks, the limp stalks of corn struggling in the parched field beyond, even the air itself, hanging golden and choking in the late afternoon light. It was the summer of 1888, and the rains had forgotten the Dakota territory. The land was dying, and Silas seemed determined to take her with it. Their homestead, grandly named Promise Creek, on the deed Silas had proudly shown her back east, was a monument to broken dreams. The creek was a cracked, muddy scar in the earth. The small barn leaned precariously, its timbers groaning in the wind that never seemed to bring coolness, only more dust. The house was little more than a shack, tar paper peeling, windows clouded with grime, the door hanging slightly askew on leather hinges. Inside smelled perpetually of dust, cheap whiskey, wood smoke, and despair. Elara moved slowly, deliberately, towards the water barrel. Every step sent fresh jolts of pain radiating from her back. She dipped the battered tin cup, the water warm and gritty. She sipped, letting the tepid liquid soothe her raw throat. Her reflection wavered in the murky surface, eyes too large and shadowed in a face prematurely lined by sun and sorrow, hair the color of faded wheat escaping its braid. 28 felt like 50. She remembered the girl who'd stepped off the train in Deadwood Gulch 5 years ago, clutching a small valise and a heart full of romantic notions fed by dime novels. Silas Barrett had seemed tall and capable, his eyes holding a promise of adventure and a future built together on the frontier. How quickly the promise had soured. The first year, disappointment had been a silent guest. The second year, it became sharp words and cold shoulders. By the third, the belt buckle and the whip had made their appearances, Silas's frustration finding its outlet on her skin, always justified by her failure. The screen door slammed. Elara flinched, sloshing water onto her dress. Silas stood framed in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the space. Even now, haggard and perpetually angry, he cut an imposing figure. His dark hair was slicked back, sweat beading on his forehead, his heavy jaw set. His eyes, a cold flint gray, scanned her dismissively. "Water in yourself while the stock goes thirsty." His voice was a low growl. "Horse troughs near empty. Get to it, woman. Ain't got time for your lazint." The stock was one bony mare and 2 scrawny chickens. But arguing was the spark to his tinderbox. Elara nodded mutely, setting the cup down. She picked up the dented bucket near the barrel, her movements stiff. The walk to the shallow well felt like miles under the relentless sun. The wind whipped miniature dust devils across the hard-packed earth. As she worked the creaking pump handle, the rhythmic groan a mournful song. Her gaze drifted beyond their meager claim. The vast, rolling prairie stretched to the horizon, an ocean of bleached gold and brown under the immense blue dome of the sky. It was terrifying in its emptiness, yet sometimes in stolen moments like this, it offered a strange solace. Out there, the weight of Silas's disappointment couldn't reach her. Out there, she could almost breathe. A movement caught her eye, far to the northwest. Squinting against the glare, she saw it, a rider. Just a dark speck against the shimmering heat haze, moving parallel to the distant line of bluffs that marked the edge of the Badlands. Too far to discern any detail, but moving with purpose. Not drifting aimlessly like a lone cowboy, nor heading towards the distant cluster of buildings that was Rattlesnake Junction, the nearest town. Elara paused, her hand still on the pump handle. Strangers were rare out here. Most folks gave the Barrett place a wide berth, wary of Silas's temper. She remembered a snippet of conversation overheard weeks ago in the stifling heat of the Junction's general store. She'd been buying salt and flour, enduring the shopkeeper's pitying glances and the whispers of other women, when two dusty cowhands came in. Settled in over at Cedar Ridge, one had said, slapping dust from his chaps. Fella named Caleb. Got a spread going, tough land, but he's making a fist of it. Brought 4 young uns with him. Can you believe? From back east after his wife passed, I heard. Kids work like troopers. 4, the shopkeeper had whistled. Man's got his hands full. Orphans? Nah, his own. Tough little saplings. Seen him riding fence with him. Girl about 12, serious as a judge. 2 boys scrapping like pups, and a little mite, maybe 5, cling on behind him on the saddle. Got a kindness about him, that Caleb. Helped Jess Mullins pull his wagon out of the creek last month. Wouldn't take nothing for it. The image had struck Elara then, piercing the fog of her own misery. A man surrounded by children, managing a ranch, possessing kindness. It felt like a story from another world. She tucked the name away, Caleb at Cedar Ridge, a tiny, forbidden ember of something. Not hope exactly, more like a reminder that other realities existed beyond the confines of Silas's rage and her barrenness. The rider on the horizon vanished behind a low swell of land, probably just a hand from one of the bigger spreads, miles away. Yet, the memory of that overheard conversation lingered, a fragile counterpoint to the pain in her back and the dread settling in her stomach. Cedar Ridge. It lay northwest, beyond the bluffs. Was that rider heading there? Did that rancher, Caleb, with his 4 children, ever pass this way? The bucket overflowed, cold water splashing over her worn boots, jolting her back. She cursed softly, a rare rebellion against clumsiness. She hefted the heavy bucket, the strain pulling at her wounded back, and began the slow trudge towards the barn. The mare, Bess, whickered softly as she approached, pushing her nose towards the water. Elara poured it carefully into the trough, the sound loud in the quiet barn. She leaned her forehead against Bess's warm, dusty neck for a moment, drawing a shaky comfort from the animal's simple presence. "At least you don't blame me, old girl," she murmured, her voice raspy. A sudden wave of nausea rolled through her, sharp and unexpected. She straightened, swallowing hard. The heat, the pain, the dust, it must be that. She fell off for days, tired, queasy at odd moments. She'd blamed it on the constant tension, the poor food, the unrelenting work. Another symptom of life under Silas Barrett. She left the barn, the acrid smell of dust and old hay clinging to her. The sun was sinking lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard, painting the dilapidated buildings in hues of orange and deepening purple. Silas was nowhere to be seen, probably passed out inside, an empty whiskey bottle beside his chair. A small mercy. Inside the shack, the air was stifling, thick with the smell of stale liquor and unwashed man. Elara moved quietly, lighting the single kerosene lamp against the encroaching gloom. Its small, smoky flame did little to dispel the shadows crowding the corners. She set about the evening chores mechanically, banking the fire in the small stove, sweeping the dirt floor, a futile battle against the ever-present dust, setting out a meager supper of cold beans and hardtack. Her back screamed with every bend and reach. She sat at the rough table, pushing the unappetizing food around her tin plate. The silence pressed in, broken only by the chirping of crickets starting their nightly chorus and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. Her gaze fell on the empty cradle again, a stark silhouette in the dim light. A fresh wave of despair threatened to drown her. The barrenness wasn't just Silas's accusation. It was her own private grief, a hollow space inside her that nothing seemed to fill. The memory of that rider, the overheard mention of children laughing on a ranch called Cedar Ridge, felt like salt rubbed into a raw wound. What must it be like to be surrounded by that noise, that life? A sound outside, the crunch of boots on gravel. Silas. He gone out? Her heart began to pound, a frantic bird trapped in her ribcage. The door creaked open. Silas stood there, silhouetted against the twilight sky. He wasn't passed out. He was alert, his eyes glittering dangerously in the lamplight. He held a half-empty whiskey bottle loosely in one hand, and in his other hand, not the whip this time, but the heavy leather strap he used for harnessing Bess. Elara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Supper forgotten. He hadn't used the harness strap before. It was thicker, heavier. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him. The thud echoed in the small space. He took a long swig from the bottle, his eyes never leaving her face. The smell of cheap whiskey rolled off him. Waste of food, he slurred, nodding at her untouched plate. Feeding useless ground. He took another step towards the table. Elara instinctively pushed her chair back, the legs scraping harshly on the floorboards. "Thought about what you are, Elara," he said, his voice deceptively low. "What you cost me." He took another step. The lamplight caught the worn, brutal length of the harness strap. 5 years. 5 years of sweat poured into dust. 5 years waiting on a promise you never kept. His voice rose, sharpening. "My name ends with me. Bear it. Dust. Because of you." He raised the strap, not to strike immediately, but to let her see it, let the threat hang in the suffocating air. "Maybe," he hissed, leaning closer, his whiskey-laden breath hot on her face. "Maybe I ain't been convincing enough. Maybe you need a stronger reminder of the debt you owe." Elara's vision blurred. The pain in her back, the gnawing emptiness in her womb, the terror coiling in her gut. It all condensed into a single, crystalline point of understanding. This wouldn't stop. It would only get worse. The harness strap wasn't just a tool. It was a promise of deeper breaking. The image of the distant rider, the impossible dream of Cedar Ridge, flickered and died. There was only this shack, this man, and the descent into a darker hell. Her gaze darted past him, to the door, to the vast, indifferent night beyond. Escape was a fantasy as barren as her body. Where would she go? How would she survive? Rattlesnake Junction offered no refuge. Silas was tolerated, feared even. She was just his troublesome wife. As Silas shifted his weight, raising the strap higher, a violent, uncontrollable surge of nausea overwhelmed her. She clapped a hand over her mouth, but it was too late. She lurched sideways, retching violently onto the dirt floor, her meager supper splattering onto the packed earth. Silas froze, the strap still raised. Disgust twisted his features. What in blazes? He lowered the strap slightly, staring at her, with a new kind of revulsion as she gasped for air, tears streaming down her face from the force of the sickness. Elara wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling hand, humiliation warring with the physical misery. She looked up at him, expecting the blow to fall now, fueled by this fresh offense. But Silas wasn't looking at her face. His flint-gray eyes were fixed lower, narrowed, calculating. They traveled slowly, deliberately from her heaving chest down to her waist, then lingered there. A strange, unsettling expression flickered across his face. Not anger, not disgust, but something cold and sharp. Suspicion, realization. The harness strap hung limp at his side. The silence in the shack was no longer heavy. It was charged, brittle, like the air before a lightning strike. Elara's blood ran cold, colder than it ever had under the lash. She followed his gaze down to her own body, to the slight, persistent ache low in her belly she'd ignored, to the weeks of fatigue and nausea she'd blamed on everything else. No, it couldn't be. After 5 years of emptiness, it was impossible, wasn't it? Silas's lips curled into a slow, terrifying smile that held no warmth, only a predator's grim satisfaction. He took a deliberate step closer, the whiskey forgotten, his eyes boring into hers with an intensity that turned her bones to ice. Well now, he breathed, the words slithering through the silence. Looks like the barren ground might finally be yielding something after all. His smile widened, revealing teeth. Ain't that just a miracle? He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. Guess we'll be needing that cradle after all, Elara. Better pray it takes. Better pray real hard. The harness strap slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. But the thread in the air was thicker, more suffocating than any blow. Elara stared at him, the nausea replaced by a terror so profound it stole her breath. The impossible had happened, and it had just made everything infinitely, horrifyingly worse. The fragile life she might carry wasn't hope. It was a death sentence, delivered with Silas Barrett's chilling smile. What would he do to ensure this miracle survived? And what would he do to her if it didn't? The shack felt different after Silas's pronouncement. Not safer, but charged with a new, suffocating tension. The harness strap lay where it had fallen, a coiled serpent on the dirt floor. Silas hadn't touched it since, nor had he struck her. Instead, he watched. His flint-gray eyes tracked her every move with an intensity that felt more invasive than the lash. The rage had transmuted into a cold, calculating vigilance. Elara was no longer just a barren wife. She was the vessel for Silas Barrett's legacy, and he intended to guard his investment. The nausea persisted, a relentless tide that rose each morning as the weak Dakota sun bleached the eastern sky. Elara retched into the bucket she kept by the door, her body convulsing, tears stinging her eyes. Silas would stand nearby, arms crossed, a grim satisfaction tightening his features. He saw the sickness not as suffering, but as proof. Strong sign. He'd grunt once, handing her a dipper of tepid water afterwards. Means it's tahine root good. Her world shrank further. Silas curtailed her trips to the well, insisting he fetch water himself, scrutinizing the amount she drank. He portioned out their meager food with exaggerated care, pushing an extra scrap of salt pork onto her plate. For the young nun, he'd say, his voice devoid of warmth, making the food turn to ash in her mouth. He forbade her from lifting anything heavier than the wash basin. Even tending to Bess became his domain, a task he performed with a brusque efficiency that bordered on hostility towards the patient mare. The cradle, once a symbol of mocking emptiness, became the focal point of Silas's scrutiny. He dragged it from the corner into the center of the single room. One afternoon, he spent hours meticulously sanding a rough spot on its edge, his large hands surprisingly careful. The rasp of the sandpaper was a constant, nerve-shredding counterpoint to Elara's pounding heart. He didn't speak as he worked. but the silence was thick with unspoken threats. Make sure it takes. Pray real hard. Elara felt like a ghost haunting her own life. She moved through the stifling shack and the dusty yard like a sleepwalker, performing the minimal chores Silas allowed. Her back still ached from the last whipping, a dull throb beneath the new, terrifying reality. Hope was a treacherous thing. The faint, impossible flutter of life within her, if it was even there, if it wasn't just sickness and despair, felt like a shackle tightening. This child, if it lived, wouldn't be hers. It would be Silas's heir, his possession, another chain binding her to this desolate patch of hell called Promise Creek. Escape, a fragile dream nurtured during moments of unbearable pain, now seemed impossibly distant, weighted down by the potential life inside her. How could she run, carrying Silas Barrett's child? Where could she possibly go where he wouldn't hunt her down? 5 days after the night of the harness strap, Silas announced they were going to Rattlesnake Junction. Need supplies, he stated, buckling on his gun belt with an air of finality. And you need looking at. Doc Evans'll know for sure. His tone brooked no argument. The journey into town was an ordeal. Silas drove the rickety wagon, Bess plodding wearily between the shafts. Elara sat rigidly beside him, the worn plank seat jolting her bones on the rutted trail. The vast, sun-blasted prairie stretched around them, indifferent to her turmoil. Dust devils danced like malevolent spirits in the distance. Silas kept glancing at her, his gaze lingering on her waist, his jaw clenched. He didn't speak, but his silence was a heavy hand pressing down on her. Rattlesnake Junction was little more than a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings. A saloon, a livery stable, a blacksmith, the general store, and a small, clapboard building with a faded sign reading Dr. Evans, Medicine and Dentistry. The air buzzed with flies and a low murmur of conversation from the saloon porch. Faces turned as Silas pulled the wagon to a halt outside the general store. Elara felt the familiar prickle of eyes, pitying, wary, or simply curious. She kept her gaze fixed on her lap, the faded calico of her dress worn thin at the knees. "Stay put," Silas ordered, climbing down. "I'll get what we need." Then we see the doc. He disappeared into the dim interior of the store. Alone on the wagon seat, Elara risked a glance around. The town felt both claustrophobic and terrifyingly exposed. Her eyes scanned the street, drawn instinctively, hopelessly, towards the northwest road leading out of town, the direction, she knew, of Cedar Ridge. The road was empty, shimmering in the heat haze. A foolish yearning tightened her throat. Caleb. The name was a silent prayer. A man with 4 children. A man known for kindness. What would he think of a woman like her? Broken, trapped, carrying her jailer's child? A commotion near the livery stable drew her attention. A sturdy farm wagon, larger and better maintained than theirs, pulled by 2 strong dappled grays, was being loaded. A man stood directing 2 boys, one around 14, lanky and serious, the other perhaps 10, freckled and energetic. The man had his back to her, broad-shouldered in a faded blue work shirt, his dark hair visible beneath a worn Stetson. He moved with a calm, capable efficiency. "Easy with that crate, Ben," the man said, his voice carrying across the street, deep, steady, with an undercurrent of patience. "That's glassware for Mrs. Henderson. Eli, hand me that rope." The younger boy, Eli, scrambled to obey, his movements quick and eager. The older boy, Ben, carefully maneuvered a wooden crate. Then, a girl of about 12 emerged from the livery, leading a saddled pony. She had braided brown hair and a thoughtful expression, carrying a smaller crate with careful determination. Behind her, almost hidden in the shadows, a tiny figure clung to the man's leg. A little girl, no more than 5, with wide, watchful eyes peering out at the dusty street. Caleb. It had to be him. The rancher from Cedar Ridge, with his 4 children. Elara's breath hitched. They were a tableau of bustling, ordinary life, a life of shared burdens, gentle instruction, and quiet care. The girl handed the crate to her father, who placed it securely in the wagon, ruffling her hair absently. He said something too low for Elara to hear, and the girl smiled, a quick, bright thing that seemed to momentarily dispel the dust and heat. The little one buried her face in her father's trousers, then peeked out again, her gaze drifting across the street and landing directly on Elara. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. The child's eyes were a clear, startling blue, filled with innocent curiosity. Elara felt a jolt, a visceral pang of something so profound it stole her breath. Longing, grief, a desperate ache for the simple, uncomplicated connection radiating from that little family. She quickly looked away, heat flooding her cheeks, feeling exposed, ashamed of her own wretchedness beside their vibrant normalcy. The moment shattered as Silas emerged from the store, a sack of flour slung over his shoulder. He followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing as they took in the scene at the livery. A dark scowl settled over his face. "Them Harkins," he muttered, dumping the flour into their wagon with a thud. "Think they own the territory 'cause they got a decent spread and a passel of brats." His contempt was palpable, tinged with something else. Envy? Come on, Doc Evans. He didn't offer his hand as Elara climbed stiffly down. He simply strode towards the doctor's office, expecting her to follow. As she passed the Harkin wagon, she kept her eyes down, but she felt Caleb's presence, a solid, calm energy. She heard the low murmur of his voice to his children. "All right, load up. Sun's getting high." There was no judgment in his tone, only the practical command of a man managing his world. It felt like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea, impossibly out of reach. Dr. Evans was a weary-looking man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers. His cramped office smelled of carbolic and dust. Silas loomed in the doorway, arms crossed, while Elara perched on the edge of the examination cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Morning, Silas, Mrs. Barrett." The doctor greeted cautiously, his eyes flicking between them, lingering on the fading bruise high on Elara's cheekbone, a souvenir from before the strap. "What brings you in?" "Woman's sick," Silas stated flatly. "Mornings mostly. Been tired. Need you to see if she's breathing." Dr. Evans's expression remained professionally neutral, but Elara saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Pity, perhaps, or resignation. "All right, Mrs. Barrett, let's have a look. Silas, if you'd step outside." Silas's jaw tightened. "I'll stay." The doctor hesitated. "Examination requires privacy, Silas. Standard procedure." A muscle ticked in Silas's cheek. He glared at the doctor, then at Elara, his gaze a clear warning. "Don't say nothing foolish." With a final, menacing look, he turned and stepped out onto the boardwalk, leaving the door slightly ajar. Elara could see the shadow of his boots just beyond the threshold. Dr. Evans sighed softly. He asked quiet, clinical questions about her symptoms, her cycles. His touch was gentle as he palpated her abdomen. Elara answered in monosyllables, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the worn rug beneath the cot. The examination felt like an eternity under the weight of Silas's proximity and the doctor's quiet pity. She felt stripped bare, her body a contested territory. Finally, Dr. Evans straightened. He washed his hands in a basin. "Well, Mrs. Barrett," he said, keeping his voice low, "based on your symptoms and the examination, it's early days, very early, but it's certainly possible. Probable, even. We'd know more in another month or so." He met her eyes. "You need rest. Good food. Less stress." He glanced meaningfully towards the door. "Possible. Probable." The words echoed in the hollow space inside her. Confirmation. A death sentence wrapped in the fragile promise of life. Elara felt dizzy. The door creaked open. Silas stood there, his eyes boring into the doctor. "Well, It's likely, Silas, Dr. Evans said, his voice carefully neutral now. As I told Mrs. Barrett, it's early. She needs care, rest, nourishment. A slow, terrifying smile spread across Silas's face. It held no joy, only a savage triumph. Told you, he said, the words aimed at Elara like bullets. Told you it was a miracle. He stepped forward, his hand clamping down possessively on Elara's shoulder, making her flinch. Don't you worry, document. I'll take good care of her now. Real good care. The promise in his voice was colder than the Dakota winter. He steered Elara out of the office, his grip firm, unyielding. The bright sunlight outside was blinding. As they walked back towards their wagon, Elara saw the Harkin wagon pulling away from the livery stable, heading northwest out of town. Caleb sat tall on the driver's bench, the reins held loosely in capable hands. Ben and Eli sat beside him, the little girl now perched on Ben's lap. The older girl rode her pony alongside, her braids swinging. They were leaving, heading back to Cedar Ridge, to their life of work and noise and kindness. Leaving her behind in the choking dust of Rattlesnake Junction with Silas Barrett's hand like an iron manacle on her arm. The ride back to Promise Creek was silent. Silas hummed tunelessly, a sound more unnerving than his usual scowling silence. The sack of flour and the small bag of beans and coffee felt like anchors in the wagon bed. The doctor's words, likely, probable, echoed with every jolt of the wheels. Silas's satisfaction was a tangible, oppressive force. He was unusually active when they returned. He unloaded the supplies himself, carrying them inside. He even drew water for her wash basin. Sit, he commanded, pointing to the chair by the table. Rest, like the doc said. Elara sat, numb. She watched him move around the shack, this man transformed by the prospect of an heir. He pulled out the small, chipped bottle of whiskey he kept hidden, not to drink himself into a stupor, but to pour a small measure into a tin cup. He pushed it towards her. Doc said nourishment, Silas stated, his eyes fixed on hers. Heard this is good for carry-in women. Settles the stomach, builds blood. His voice held a false, chilling solicitousness. Drink it. The smell of raw alcohol hit her nostrils, sharp and repellent. It was cheap, harsh stuff, the kind that burned like fire. Elara stared at the cup, then up at Silas. His expression was expectant, demanding. This wasn't care, it was a test, a display of his control, an assertion that he knew best, that his will governed her body and the life it might hold. Her stomach, already unsettled, clenched violently. She shook her head slightly, a tiny, instinctive rebellion. Silas, it'll make me sick. His eyes hardened. The false kindness evaporated like water on hot stone. You questioning me, woman? He asked, his voice dangerously low. He leaned closer, resting his knuckles on the table. After everything, after the doc just confirmed the blessing we got, you gonna define me on what's good for my son? He picked up the cup, pushing it insistently towards her lips. The smell was overwhelming. Drink it now. The harness strap lay coiled in the corner, a silent reminder. The cradle sat in the center of the room, an empty threat waiting to be filled. The distant, impossible image of Caleb Harkin's steady hand on the reins faded. There was only this cup, this man, and the terrifying life taking root inside her. A life Silas would shape with the same iron fist that had scarred her back. The weight of the womb was crushing. As the rim of the tin cup touched her lips, the raw fumes triggering an immediate gag reflex, Elara knew. Hope wasn't just treacherous, it was extinct. Survival now meant swallowing more than just whiskey. It meant swallowing her terror, her revulsion, and the bitter knowledge that the miracle was her doom. The liquid, harsh and burning, trickled onto her tongue as Silas watched, his flint-gray eyes gleaming with absolute, terrifying dominion. The taste wasn't just of alcohol. It was the taste of surrender and the dawning horror that this was only the beginning. The cheap whiskey burned like liquid fire all the way down, igniting a fresh, violent wave of nausea that had Elara retching over the wash basin minutes later. Silas watched, his expression a mixture of disgust and grim satisfaction. He hadn't made her drink more. The point had been made. Her body, the potential life within it, belonged to him. Her rebellion, however instinctive, however rooted in self-preservation, was unacceptable. The taste of surrender, bitter and acrid, lingered long after the whiskey was expelled, a constant reminder of her cage. Weeks bled into one another under the Dakota sun, bleached and unforgiving. The drought deepened, sucking the last vestiges of moisture from the land. Promise Creek was a cracked scar, the cornfield a graveyard of stunted, gray stalks. Bess grew thinner, her ribs stark against her dull coat. The air itself felt brittle, charged with a desperate tension that mirrored Elara's own. Her body changed. The nausea ebbed slightly, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness and a subtle, terrifying rounding beneath her worn dresses. Silas noted every shift. His vigilance became a prison without walls. He barred her from strenuous chores entirely. Fetching water, tending the pathetic garden patch, even mending fences, all became his domain, performed with a resentful efficiency that underscored his belief this was her burden forcing his labor. He watched her eat, pushing extra scraps of food her way with the same impersonal detachment as tossing grain to a chicken. For the boy, he'd grunt, his flint-gray eyes fixed on her belly. He decided it was a son, Silas Barrett Jr. His legacy. He began to talk at her belly in the evenings, his voice rough but carrying a strange, possessive warmth that never touched his eyes when they met hers. He spoke of the land, his land, how it would flourish under a Barrett heir. He spoke of teaching the boy to shoot, to break horses, to be hard. The cradle, meticulously sanded, sat like a silent sentinel in the center of the room, a constant, looming presence. Elara felt the life within her quicken, tiny flutters like moth wings against glass. Instead of joy, cold dread washed over her. This fragile being was already claimed, already shaped in Silas's harsh image. How could she protect it? How could she protect herself? Her resilience, worn thin but unbroken, found purchase in secrecy. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the cold stove, wrapped in a scrap of faded velvet, lay a small, sharp bone-handled knife. It had been her father's, a whittling tool, slipped into her valise before she left the East, a forgotten talisman. Finding it weeks ago, cleaning a neglected corner, had felt like unearthing a piece of her old self. Now, it was her silent rebellion. Running her fingers over the smooth bone handle in stolen moments became a ritual. It wasn't a plan, not yet, but a promise. I am still here. I will not disappear entirely. The knife whispered of a different kind of hardness, the quiet, desperate kind needed for survival. One scorching afternoon, while Silas was patching the barn roof with curses and hammer blows that echoed across the desolate yard, Elara sat in the meager shade of the porch, shelling the last of the pitiful beans. The heat pressed down, thick and suffocating. A dust devil spun wildly in the far field, a momentary frenzy in the stillness. Her gaze, as it often did now, drifted towards the northwest bluffs, the direction of Cedar Ridge. A movement on the horizon line caught her eye. Not a dust devil, but a rider leading a pack horse. They were closer than the previous rider, maybe half a mile out, heading not towards Rattlesnake Junction, but seemingly angling towards Promise Creek. Elara's heart stuttered. Hope, treacherous and unwelcome, flared. Caleb? But why would he come here? Silas's reputation ensured visitors were as rare as rain. Before she could process it, the screen door slammed. Silas stood there, shirtless, sweat glistening on his chest and arms, hammer dangling from his hand. He followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing to slits. The rider was clearly visible now, a man on a sturdy bay, a young girl perched behind him on the saddle. her bonnet a splash of faded blue against the dun landscape. "Who the hell's that?" Silas growled, his voice tight with suspicion. He dropped the hammer with a clatter and strode inside, emerging moments later buckling his gun belt, his expression thunderous. He positioned himself at the edge of the porch, a formidable, unwelcoming statue. The rider approached at a steady walk. As he drew nearer, Elara recognized the broad shoulders, the calm set of his body, even in the saddle. Caleb Harkin. The girl behind him, clutching his waist, was the serious-faced 12-year-old she'd seen in town, Maggie. They stopped a respectful distance from the porch, the bay horse stamping impatiently, raising little puffs of dust. "Morning," Caleb called out, his voice calm and deep, cutting through the heavy air. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture encompassing both Silas and Elara, though his gaze lingered briefly on Elara's strained face before settling on Silas. "Name's Caleb Harkin, from over Cedar Ridgeway. Hate to trouble you." Silas didn't return the greeting. His hand rested near the butt of his revolver. "What'd you want, Harkin? We ain't got spare water, if that's it." His tone was flat, hostile. Caleb nodded, unfazed by the rudeness. "Aware of that, Mr. Barrett. Drought's hitting everyone hard. It's actually about the creek line, or what's left of it." He gestured vaguely northwest. "My spread sits higher. My boys were checking the upper springs yesterday, barely a trickle. Noticed the main channel down this way seems completely dry further up. Just wanted to see if you knew of any breaks or blockages between your place and the junction. Figured if we pooled knowledge, maybe we could find where the waters sink in or divert in before it gets this far down. Benefit us all." Elara watched, heart pounding. Caleb's words were practical, reasonable, spoken with a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with Silas's bristling aggression. He was trying to help, even offering a potential solution. She saw Maggie peering out from behind her father, her intelligent eyes taking in the dilapidated homestead, the grim-faced man on the porch, the thin woman shelling beans. There was no fear in the girl's gaze, only a quiet assessment. Silas snorted. "Creek's been dry since spring. Nothing to be done about it except pray for rain. Wasting your time, Harkin, and mine." He made no move to invite them closer or offer water for their horses. Caleb studied Silas for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He glanced again at Elara, a flicker of something unidentifiable. Concern? Recognition of her tension? In his eyes. "I see," he said slowly. "Well, appreciate your time nonetheless. If you do notice anything upstream worth looking at," he let the offer hang. He shifted slightly in the saddle. "Come on, Maggie May. Nothing for us here." He gently nudged the bay, turning its head. As the horse pivoted, Maggie's small hand fumbled at her side. A scrap of white fluttered loose from her pocket, caught by a sudden, hot gust of wind. It danced across the hard-packed earth, spinning like a tiny ghost, landing mere feet from the porch steps. A simple cotton handkerchief, embroidered clumsily in one corner with a small blue flower. Silas glared at it as if it were a snake. "Get your trash off my land, girl," he snapped. Maggie's cheeks flushed, but before Caleb could speak or dismount, Elara moved. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, a need to connect with that fleeting glimpse of normalcy, she set down her bowl of beans and stepped off the porch. Ignoring Silas's sharp intake of breath, she walked the few steps and bent stiffly, her pregnancy making the movement awkward. Her fingers closed around the soft cotton. She straightened, meeting Maggie's wide eyes. "Here," Elara said, her voice raspy from disuse. She held out the handkerchief. "You dropped it." Maggie hesitated, glancing at her father. Caleb gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The girl leaned down from the saddle, her small hand brushing Elara's as she took the handkerchief. Her fingers were warm, calloused from work, yet undeniably young. "Thank you, ma'am," Maggie murmured, her voice clear and soft. The brief contact, the simple courtesy, sent a jolt through Elara. It was the first gentle human touch, the first words spoken to her without fear or contempt in longer than she could remember. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. "Much obliged, Mrs. Barrett," Caleb said, his voice deeper, warmer now. His gaze held hers for a fraction longer than necessary, conveying a world of unspoken understanding. He saw the bruises, the tension, the haunted look. "You take care now." He touched his hat brim again. "Silas." The farewell to her husband was curt, devoid of warmth. As they turned and rode away, heading back towards the bluffs, Elara clutched the lingering sensation of Maggie's touch. She stared after them, the scrap of blue bonnet disappearing into the shimmering heat haze. "Take care." The words echoed in the hollow space inside her. A kindness, a lifeline thrown from a passing ship. "Get inside, woman," Silas snarled, breaking the spell. He grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging in her flesh just above the elbow. "Making a spectacle of yourself. Simperin' at strangers." He propelled her towards the door. "That Harkin, think he's better cause he's got water troubles too? Got a passel of brats cluttering up his place? Looked at you like you was some stray pup." His jealousy and resentment were a palpable force. "Don't you begin ideas. You belong here. That boy belongs here. Barrett land. Barrett blood." He shoved her inside the shack. "Now where's that knife?" Elara froze, her blood turning to ice. The world tilted. Knife? How could he know? Had he seen her find it? Had he been watching her secret moments at the loose floorboard? I don't know what you mean, Silas," she stammered, her voice trembling. She backed towards the table, putting it between them. "Don't play dumb," he roared, advancing. The harness strap lay coiled in the corner, but he didn't reach for it. His fury was colder, more focused. "The one you've been hiding, the one your pa gave you. Think I didn't see you pawing at that floorboard like a dog burying a bone." He kicked the leg of the table, making the tin plates rattle. "Think I let you keep a weapon? After today? After you making eyes at that rancher?" Spittle flew from his lips. "You planning something, Elara? Planning to harm my son? Or me?" He lunged, not at her, but towards the stove. He dropped to his knees, his large hands scrabbling at the loose floorboard she'd so carefully pried up only that morning to touch the bone handle. Terror, pure and blinding, seized her. The knife wasn't just defiance. If he found it now, in his current state, fueled by jealousy and the perceived threat of Caleb Harkin's brief presence, it would be proof of her betrayal. Proof she needed to be broken completely. "No, Silas, please." The plea tore from her, raw and desperate. "It's just an old thing. A keepsake. I wasn't." He ignored her. His fingers found the edge of the board. He wrenched it upwards with a splintering crack. The dusty cavity beneath was exposed. And there, gleaming dully in the shaft of light from the doorway, lay the bone-handled knife. Silas went very still. The air in the shack thickened, charged with a violence more potent than any storm. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into the hole and pulled the knife out. He held it up, examining the sharp, 3-inch blade, the smooth bone handle. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying fury. He turned his head slowly, his flint-gray eyes locking onto hers. The world outside darkened abruptly. A bank of heavy, purple-black clouds, unnoticed in the tension, had blotted out the sun. The first fat drops of rain, long prayed for, began to spatter against the roof like thrown stones. But inside Promise Creek, a different kind of storm had broken. Silas rose to his full height, the knife held loosely in his hand, his eyes never leaving Elara's terrified face. The flickering light from the small window caught the edge of the blade. The rain drummed harder, a frantic counterpoint to the silence stretching between them, thin and deadly as a wire. He took a step towards her, the knife glinting. The promise in his eyes wasn't just of punishment, it was annihilation. "Keepsake," he whispered, the word a venomous hiss that cut through the sudden roar of the downpour. "Let's see what else you're keeping from me, Elara." The cradle, the storm, the knife, everything converged in that terrible moment, holding its breath. The rain lashed the roof, a deafening roar, as Silas Barrett closed the distance. The rain hammered the shack like 1,000 fists, drowning out the world beyond the thin walls of Promise Creek. Silas stood before Elara, the bone-handled knife gleaming in his grip, its blade catching the flicker of the kerosene lamp. His flint-gray eyes burned with a fury colder than the storm outside, each word a blade of its own. "Keepsake," he repeated, his whisper slicing through the roar of the downpour. "You think I'm fool enough to believe that?" He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under his weight, the knife held not as a weapon, but as a verdict. Elara's heart pounded, her breath shallow, her body pinned by the weight of his gaze and the terror of what came next. She backed against the rough-hewn table, its edge biting into her hips. The cradle loomed in the center of the room, a silent witness to her failure and Silas's obsession. Her hand instinctively drifted to her belly, where the faint flutter of life stirred, a life that felt less like hope and more like a noose tightening. "Silas, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "It's nothing, just my father's. I wasn't going to. Don't lie to me," he roared, his voice shattering the air. He slammed the knife point first into the table, the blade sinking deep into the wood with a sickening thud. Elara flinched, her knees buckling, but she caught herself against the table's edge. The storm outside raged, sheets of water lashing the warped window panes. But the real tempest was here, in Silas's eyes, in the betrayal he saw in her hidden defiance. "You think you can plot against me? Against my son?" He yanked the knife free, splinters flying, and pointed it at her belly. "You'd cut him out before you let him be a bear, wouldn't you?" "No." The word tore from her, raw and desperate. Her hands flew up, palms out, as if they could shield her from his wrath or the truth he twisted. "I'd never hurt. I'd never." Her voice broke, tears mingling with the sweat and fear on her face. She thought of the knife, her father's keepsake, the only piece of her past that had felt like strength. Now it was a death sentence, proof of her rebellion in Silas's warped mind. She thought of Caleb Harkin, of Maggie's soft hand and clear blue eyes, of a life where kindness wasn't a trap. But that life was miles away, across a rain-soaked prairie, and she was here, trapped in this shack with a man who saw her as nothing more than a vessel for his legacy. Silas lowered the knife slowly, his chest heaving, but the danger didn't recede. He stepped back, his boots leaving muddy prints on the dirt floor. "You don't touch nothing sharp again," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You don't hide nothing. You're mine, Elara. That boy's mine. This land's mine." He tossed the knife onto the table, where it skittered and stopped, its blade glinting like a warning. "I'm locking you in tonight. Can't trust you no more." He turned, grabbing a rusted padlock from a shelf, and moved to the door, his movements jerky with barely contained rage. The lock clicked into place, a sound more final than the storm's roar. Elara sank into the chair, her hands trembling in her lap. The rain pounded the roof, a relentless drumbeat that echoed her racing pulse. She was alone, but not free. The shack was her prison now, the cradle her sentence, and Silas's obsession her executioner. Her fingers brushed her belly, the faint movement within a cruel reminder of her powerlessness. She couldn't run, not with the storm turning the trails to mud, not with Silas's eyes watching her every move, not with a child tying her to this place. But the memory of Maggie's handkerchief, of Caleb's steady voice, flickered like a candle in a gale. "Take care." The words were a lifeline, fragile but unbroken. The storm raged through the night, the wind howling like her unspoken fears. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the world outside a sodden, muddy mess. Silas was gone when Elara woke, the lock still in place, the knife still on the table, mocking her, She pressed her face to the grimy window, the glass cold against her cheek. The yard was a quagmire, the barn's roof sagging under the weight of the rain. Bess stood miserably under a makeshift lean-to, her head low. The cornfield was a ruin, stalks flattened into the mud like broken promises. A faint clatter broke the silence. A wagon, its wheels creaking through the muck. Elara's heart leapt, then sank. Not Silas. His wagon was quieter, the mare's plodding gait unmistakable. This was someone else. She strained to see through the smeared glass, her breath fogging the pain. A small cart, pulled by a single mule, emerged from the mist. A boy sat on the driver's bench, no older than 10, his hat too big for his head, his freckled face set with determination. Eli, one of Caleb's boys, she realized, her pulse quickening. He was alone, no sign of Caleb or the others. The cart carried a small crate, lashed down with rope. Eli hopped down, his boots sinking into the mud. He glanced at the shack, then at the barn, his eyes wary but purposeful. He approached the porch, hesitating at the locked door. "Mrs. Barrett?" he called, his voice high but steady, cutting through the drizzle. "You there? Pa sent me. Got something for you." Elara's breath caught. She moved to the door, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the padlock. "Eli," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She raised it slightly. What is it?" She didn't dare hope, didn't dare believe Caleb would risk Silas's wrath. But the boy's presence was a crack in her prison, a sliver of light. "It's just supplies," Eli said, his voice muffled by the door. "Pa heard the storm hit you hard. Said you might need flour, maybe some salt. He saw you in town, ma'am. Said you looked like you could use a kindness." He set the crate on the porch steps with a thud, the sound heavy in the quiet. "I ain't supposed to stay. Pa said Mr. Barrett don't take kindly to visitors." Elara pressed her hands against the door, tears welling. A kindness. The word was a blade, cutting through her despair. She wanted to scream, to beg Eli to unlock the door, to take her to Cedar Ridge, to safety. But she couldn't. Not with Silas's threat hanging over her, not with the life inside her anchoring her to this place. "Thank you," she managed, her voice breaking. "Tell your pa. Tell him I'm grateful." Eli nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I will, ma'am." He hesitated, then added, quieter, "Maggie said you looked sad. She kept your name in her prayers." He turned, his boots squelching as he climbed back onto the cart. The mule snorted, and the cart rolled away, disappearing into the misty drizzle. Elara sank to the floor, her back against the door, tears streaming down her face. Maggie's prayers, Caleb's kindness, they were distant stars in a storm-dark sky, unreachable but real. She thought of the knife on the table, now a symbol of her exposed defiance. She couldn't use it, not against Silas, not with a child to protect, but she could act. She had to. The crate outside was a lifeline, a reason to move. Silas would be back soon, his suspicions sharper than ever after Caleb's visit. She had to hide her hope, her strength, before he crushed it entirely. She stood, her movements slow but deliberate. The lock held her in, but the shack had weaknesses. The back window, its frame warped by years of neglect, gave slightly when she pushed. She worked quietly, her fingers trembling as she pried at the rusted nails. The drizzle outside masked the faint creaks, the wood groaning under her efforts. If she could get the crate, hide it, maybe use its contents to barter in town, to plan something. Escape was a dream, but survival was a necessity. The window gave way, a sliver of freedom just wide enough for her to slip through. The mud was cold, clinging to her skirts as she dropped to the ground. She grabbed the crate, its weight surprising, and dragged it back through the window, her heart pounding with every sound. Inside, she pried it open, flour, salt, a small sack of dried apples. And tucked beneath, a folded note, the handwriting childish but clear. "Mrs. Barrett, we're at Cedar Ridge if you need us. C.H. Caleb. Her breath hitched. She hid the note in her bodice, her fingers trembling with the weight of its promise. But as she shoved the crate under the table, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the drizzle. Silas. He was back, too soon. The mud would show her tracks. The open window would betray her. Panic seized her, her hands fumbling as she pushed the window shut, the nails refusing to hold. The door rattled, the padlock clinking. Elara. Silas's voice was a thunderclap, sharper than the storm's echo. What in hell's this crate doing here? His boots stomped onto the porch, the lock scraping as he fumbled with the key. The knife still lay on the table, gleaming accusingly. Her muddy skirts, the disturbed window, the crate. Every choice she'd made in the last hour screamed betrayal. The door swung open, Silas filling the frame, his eyes wild with fury. He saw the mud on her dress, the crate's edge peeking from under the table. His gaze snapped to the window, then back to her, and the realization hit like a bullet. "You've been out," he hissed, stepping inside, the knife now in his hand again. And that Harkin plots in behind my back." The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with a new storm, one that promised to break her completely. Silas's silhouette filled the doorway, a storm-dark shadow against the gray drizzle beyond. The bone-handled knife glinted in his fist, its blade a cold accusation. Elara stood frozen, her muddy skirts clinging to her legs, the crate's edge betraying her from beneath the table. The air in the shack was thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and Silas's rage. His eyes, flint gray and unyielding, traced the evidence of her defiance. The disturbed window, the mud on her hands, the crate that shouldn't be there. "Plot 10, he hissed, stepping inside, the door slamming shut behind him. "With that Harkin, thinking you can slip away? Take my son." His voice was a low growl, each word a hammer blow. "You'll learn, Elara. You'll learn what it means to cross a Barrett." Her heart thundered, her breath shallow and sharp. The cradle loomed in the room's center, a silent chain binding her to this life. The note from Caleb, tucked against her skin, burned like a coal, a secret she couldn't afford to lose. She backed away, her hands trembling, until her spine hit the rough wall. "Silas, I wasn't," she began, but her voice cracked, swallowed by the fear that he'd see through her lie. The knife wasn't just a tool. It was her defiance, her hope, now turned against her. She thought of Eli's freckled face, Maggie's blue eyes, Caleb's steady take care. They were so close, yet impossibly far. Across a muddy prairie she couldn't cross alone. Silas advanced, the knife held low, his boots leaving wet smears on the dirt floor. "Don't lie to me," he roared, slamming his free hand against the table, making the tin plates jump. "I saw the boy, Harkins Brad, bringing you supplies like you're some charity case." His face twisted, jealousy and paranoia contorting his features. "He's got designs, don't he? Thinks he can take what's mine." He grabbed the crate, wrenching it from under the table, and upended it. Flour spilled across the floor, the sack of dried apples bursting open, scattering fruit like small, sad stones. "This what you're planning with? Running off with my heir?" Elara's knees buckled, but she held herself upright, her hand instinctively cradling her belly. The faint flutter within was a fragile thread, a life she couldn't let Silas claim entirely. "I didn't ask for it," she whispered, her voice steadier than she felt. "It was just kindness." The word felt foreign, dangerous, but it was her only defense. "I wasn't planning nothing." Silas's laugh was a harsh bark, void of humor. "Kindness." He stepped closer, the knife's tip inches from her chest. "Ain't no kindness in this world, woman. Just weakness. And you're weak." He leaned in, his whiskey-sour breath hot on her face. "But I'll make you strong. I'll make you worthy of carrying a Barrett." He grabbed her wrist, twisting it until she gasped, the note in her bodice shifting against her skin. She prayed he wouldn't feel it, wouldn't search her. A sharp crack split the air, not thunder, but with splintering. Silas froze, his head snapping toward the door. Another crack, louder, followed by the groan of rusted hinges giving way. The door burst open, mud and water splashing inward, and Caleb Harkin stood there, his broad frame filling the threshold. His Stetson was soaked, water dripping from its brim, his blue work shirt clinging to his shoulders. Behind him, Maggie and Ben stood, their faces pale but resolute, clutching a length of rope and a crowbar. The drizzle framed them, a gray curtain against the storm's aftermath. "Barrett," Caleb said, his voice low, steady, cutting through the shack's tension like a blade through cloth. "Let her go." His eyes flicked to Elara, taking in her mud-streaked dress, her trembling form, the knife in Silas's hand. His jaw tightened, but his voice held no waver. "This ain't how a man treats his wife." Silas released Elara's wrist, shoving her back as he turned to face Caleb. "You got no business here. Harkin," he snarled, raising the knife. "This is my land, my woman, my son. Get off my claim, or I'll gut you where you stand." Elara stumbled against the wall, her breath hitching. Caleb's presence was a lifeline, but it was also a spark in a powder keg. She saw Maggie's wide eyes, Ben's clenched fists, the crowbar still in his hand. They were just children, yet here they were, risking Silas's wrath for her, a stranger. Her gaze darted to the knife on the table, then to the open door. The muddy trail beyond led to freedom, but also to danger. She couldn't run, not yet, not with Silas so close, not with the child inside her. Caleb stepped inside, his boots deliberate on the wet floor. "Ain't here to steal nothing," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "But I seen enough in town, heard enough. Your wife's hurt, Barrett. Ain't no man's right to break what's his to protect." He gestured to Maggie and Ben. "My kid saw it too. Eli told me about the crate, about how she looked. We don't stand by when folks need help." Silas's face darkened, his grip tightening on the knife. "You call me a coward on my own land?" He lunged, not at Caleb, but at Elara, grabbing her arm and yanking her in front of him like a shield. The knife pressed against her side, its edge cold through her thin dress. "You want her? Take her corpse." His voice was a snarl, his arm a vice around her. Elara's vision blurred with panic, but something inside her snapped, a spark of the hardness she'd clung to with the hidden knife. She drove her elbow back, catching Silas in the ribs. He grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She twisted free, stumbling toward the table, her hand closing around the bone-handled knife. Not to fight, she couldn't, not against Silas's strength, but to hold it, to claim her defiance one last time. Caleb moved, swift and sure, tackling Silas before he could recover. The two men crashed to the floor, the knife skittering from Silas's hand. Maggie screamed, clutching Ben's arm, but Ben dropped the crowbar and grabbed a chair, holding it ready. Elara backed toward the door, the knife trembling in her grip, her heart a wild drumbeat. The shack was chaos, grunts, splintering wood, the roar of blood in her ears. Silas was stronger, fueled by rage, but Caleb was steady, his movements precise. He pinned Silas's arm, slamming it against the floor until the fight drained from him. "Enough!" Caleb barked, his voice cutting through the struggle. He hauled Silas up, shoving him against the wall, his forearm pressed to Silas's throat. "You're done hutting her." Silas spat, his eyes wild but trapped. "She's mine," he rasped. "You can't take what's mine." "She ain't property," Caleb said, his voice low, final. He turned to Elara, his eyes softening despite the tension. "Mrs. Barrett, you're coming with us. Cedar Ridge is safe. You and your child." Elara's knees buckled, the knife slipping from her fingers to the floor. Maggie rushed forward, catching her arm, her small hand steady. "It's okay, ma'am," she whispered, her blue eyes fierce with conviction. "We got you." The world tilted, the shack's walls blurring. Elara let Maggie guide her outside, the drizzle cool against her fevered skin. Ben followed, keeping a wary eye on Silas, who sagged against the wall, defeated but not broken. Caleb tied Silas's wrists with the rope, his movements efficient. "You'll answer for this," Caleb said, his voice hard. "Sheriff in the junction will hear about it." The ride to Cedar Ridge was a blur of mud and mist, Elara cradled in the cart beside Maggie, Ben driving the mule with quiet focus. The homestead faded behind them, its cradle and chains swallowed by the prairie. Cedar Ridge was different, alive with the noise of children, the creak of a sturdy barn, the smell of fresh hay. Caleb's 3 other children greeted them, their faces curious but kind. The youngest, the tiny girl, tugged at Elara's skirt, offering a shy smile. Elara sat by their hearth that night, a quilt around her shoulders, a mug of broth warming her hands. The children's chatter filled the air, a sound so foreign it ached. Caleb watched her from across the room, his expression gentle but guarded. "You're safe here," he said, "but it ain't over. Silas will come. Men like him don't let go easy." She nodded, her hand resting on her belly. The flutter within was stronger now, a promise of life she could finally claim as her own. The road ahead was uncertain. Silas's shadow loomed. The law was slow, and her wounds, both visible and hidden, would take time to heal. But for the first time in years, Elara felt the weight of hope, not as a trap, but as a possibility. Cedar Ridge wasn't just a place. It was a beginning, fragile but real, built on the kindness of strangers who'd become her family. The fire crackled, and outside, the Dakota night stretched vast and quiet. Elara closed her eyes, Maggie's small hand still warm in hers, and let herself breathe.